Super. I would like to introduce Dr. Browd this afternoon. And this is a little bit of a departure from our 5 New Things series, as you can see. Dr. Browd graciously stepped in when a 5 New Things person wasn't able to come. So thank you so much for coming and talking to us. So just a little bit about Dr. Browd. He's one of our neurosurgeons. He's over at Seattle Children's. Hails originally from Miami and did his MD and Ph.D. at the University of Florida there, then headed west to Utah, and that's where he did his neurosurgery residency, and then made his way up here to do a pediatric neurosurgery fellowship, and has been with us ever since. He is involved in education. He's the Associate Program Director for Neurosurgery. He it seems like writes a lot and publishes a lot in areas such as hydrocephalus, spina bifida, and other things, especially related to pediatric neurosurgery, as well as functional MRI. And I can't quite tell what you're going to be telling us about today from the title of your talk, but I will learn soon, so thank you for coming.
It's a pleasure to come and talk to you guys. I thought I would do something a little different. You get talked to about neurology and neurosurgery all the time. So I'm going to talk to you about something different because this has been a very impactful thing, and it's been sort of a very big focus of my academic career of the last 6 years. So my PhD is in functional imaging. I thought I was going to come here and do fMRI and do all these different things around that. And going on about 7 years ago, I treat a ton of kids with hydrocephalus. That's one of my main interests clinically and also on a research side. And for those of you who see these patients routinely, as all of you do, you know that shunts are a life-saving device, but they fail at an incredibly high rate. So the numbers we throw out are within the first year, 30% will fail, 40% in 2 years, and 98% within 10 years are sort of the general numbers we use. And taking care of these kids and seeing the families is very impactful to me, and it seemed like we should be doing something different. Because if you had a pacemaker that failed like that, right, people would be up in arms, but we seem to accept this for neurologic device, which is ridiculous. And kind of looking critically at the technology, it really hadn't evolved very much in the last at least decade, and the big evolution in shunt technology was basically a programmable shunt, which is a misnomer because it's really not programmable, it's adjustable. So it doesn't have any smart guts to it or anything like this. And that was a nice advance because we didn't have to go back to the OR if we put in a low pressure and needed a medium pressure. But it really didn't do a lot in terms of diagnosing the patient and those type of things. And so I got interested in this problem, and we work at a pretty amazing university. There's some very bright people. Went to bioengineering, said, hey, I got this problem. I've got a couple ideas. And I met one of the young bioengineering professors, and we started working around the concept of a new implantable electronic shunt. And so this was my first introduction to this concept of taking an idea and moving it forward with the idea of trying to get it out into patients. So kind of fast forward, that project we realized, and I learned a lot about business with the early bits of this. So we have technology that we can do this, but the market size for shunts is actually pretty small. So when I hear these numbers, I used to think that they're enormous. So worldwide shunt valves is about a $200 million business per year. So I used to think, wow, that seems like a nice number. But when you start to develop these ideas and you start to go out and you talk to like a venture capitalist who you're going to need to get enough funds in to develop it, take it to the FDA, something new and novel like this has to go through what's called a PMA pathway. And I'll talk more about this in the lecture. But that's really where you have to do clinical trials. Those become extraordinarily expensive. We estimated that to develop the device would be somewhere between $20 to $30 million. And with a market size of $200 million a year, we couldn't get anybody interested in investing that money. Now, it sounds like a bad story, but actually turned into a good story. So we realized that the technology we had could be used for a device to manage external ventricular drains. And if you look critically at EVDs, they're very rudimentary. It's basically a burette on a stick. And we raise and lower it to get the ICP and the drainage we want. A lot of issues. Patients sit up, sit down, they overdrain, they underdrain. And if you have overdrainage, you can have cerebral hemorrhages, subdurals, other things that can occur. So we realized that the technology we were working on originally as the implant made for a really nice device that was an external box to manage ventriculostomies, which is actually a better business because it's one of the most common neurosurgery procedures performed worldwide. And it was a nice business model, and we thought we could go through the FDA on a lesser type of clearance called a 510K. And I'll talk a little bit about this and take questions if you guys have those. But basically a 510K pathway is you say you're equivalent to something else that's on the market. And so we thought that we could do this for about $8 million, between $5 and $8 million. And so we ended up launching a company out of the university, hired a bunch of people. The company is in Bothell. Devices are being made, and we actually just went through the FDA and got some good results back just very recently. I'll tell you about that later. Yeah. So I wanted to go through because this has been very impactful for me. So I've now spun out 5 companies out of the university, several around neurologic devices. The most promising one, I should say, to date is this new football helmet that we developed. So I literally sketched on a napkin 3 years ago the idea for a new football helmet because I run the concussion program at Children's, do the sideline stuff for the Seahawks, and it just seemed like everybody was looking at sensors, which is after the event happened. It seemed like, well, why are we not looking at safety equipment? Helmets hadn't evolved in 40 years. Went to the chair of mechanical engineering here at Per Reinhold with literally some crappy napkin sketches of some ideas that I had to improve it. And we sat down and started working on it. There's money at the university to get some of the pilot stuff going. Fast forward 3 years, I was on the field Monday after getting out of the OR. The entire Husky team is outfitted with our helmet. The entire Oregon Duck team is wearing the helmet. Every NFL team is trialing the helmet this year, and 50 NCAA teams are going to do it. We've raised $20 million for the company. The company has 50 plus employees in 3 years. And so the reason I tell you this is that an idea based on what you do clinically can be very impactful. And I've looked now differently at what I do in many ways. I look very critically at my work environment, places where I see friction in my life. I kind of go, why do we do that? And I think that there's enormous opportunity, especially in an academic institution like this, for folks in this room and for everybody who's listening, who sees patients, to come up with ideas that are going to change the way we practice in a meaningful way. So I'm going to go through in the first deck here some nuts and bolts of just issues that come up that you need to be aware of as you're thinking about ideas. And then just for fun at the end, I'll show you the pitch deck and the slide deck for the football helmet because it's very fancy and nice looking. So, everybody's worried about their disclosures. Very proud of my disclosures. So I co-founded all these companies. I'm the chief medical officer. I sit on the board of directors, and there's 2 others that are not listed here, Therma Neurosciences, and then we just started up an AR, VR company that I'm excited about around healthcare and industry space. It's called eLoops. So, why do you guys care I mentioned this? Everybody's very smart. You're always kind of problem solving if you really think about what you do on a day-to-day basis, okay? And I mentioned the university. University is a really interesting place. There's a lot of brilliant people in very interesting subspecialty areas. I talk a lot about engineering and have worked with bio-E, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering. But there's a host of people around campus here who have great expertise, who love and would die to work with a doctor on a problem. And I've also become hot on this idea of as academic people, how do we get promoted? So everybody's like, write papers, write papers, write papers. And so everybody, if we really think about it, we write a bunch of some great stuff, and a lot of average stuff, and a fair bit of crap, okay? Because you want to get a bunch of papers written. And I think that there's another academic model, especially as there's more push toward academic productivity, that's a viable path, which is this idea of clinician innovator, where you're partnering up with these guys, you're solving real world problems and pushing things out that actually touch and impact patients. So I think that there's definitely a role for basic science. This is probably not quite that, although many of the things we've done have involved in the early stages, clear basic science type projects. But I think that there's a role in academia to do this type of work where I talk about impact. So what is impact? Impact is, are you putting a device in somebody? Have you made a medication? Have you done something that in a concrete way moves the field forward and is touching patients? And for me, I've been very fortunate that this has been one of the reasons I've been promoted is, doing this type of stuff. We have multiple patents through the university, different companies, and we're starting to really see now an impact of the work that's been going on over the last few years. So again, I think this idea of being able to take an idea and move it forward is important. And sort of, how does this stuff, how does it happen, and what is of value as the process occurs? And I listed a few things here. When you're first starting out, you're disclosing an idea or a concept or work that you've done to the university. You're developing, hopefully, some patents to protect what you've done. There's licenses that can be generated. So some people don't want to move on with the company or be involved as it moves along, and ideas can get licensed out to bigger companies, and then they take them forward. And that's a very viable path. Company formation is a company ultimately acquired by somebody who's going to take it forward. So with the device we're working on for hydrocephalus, our hope is that a company like a Medtronic or a Codman will ultimately take it and be able to distribute it worldwide. We don't want to build a sales force and do that stuff. It's not really practical. So those are important milestones. And then really having something that's out on the market that touches a patient. So within neurosurgery, we've tried to set up this concept of an innovation center where physicians can come in, bring ideas. I try and help bring some of the experience that I've had. We work with the Tech Transfer Center at the university. I should have updated this deck. They're now called CoMotion, not C4C. But there's many advisors, people who've done this type of stuff before who can act as mentors. There's people from industry who come in, and then there's funders who also kind of circulate around. I think it's a very powerful concept of matching physicians with the engineering staff, because you can have the idea, but most of the time you're not going to have the expertise or the time to make it real. And that's been a very powerful thing for me to pair up with these guys. One of the things that you want to do early on too is really understand if there's a viable path forward for your idea. So I have some really interesting colleagues who I'm sure many of you have met who have what they think are brilliant ideas all the time, which many of them are, some are not. And what makes for something that you can actually move forward is a complicated thing on some level. It depends on whether or not you have intellectual property or an idea that you think is unique. It also depends on the market and whether there's the ability to make money once it's outside of the university around it. So I've had several colleagues come up and go, this is the greatest idea, I really need this. I would use it at least 10 times a year. That's probably not something that transforms into a viable thing to move forward. And it's a simple exercise for those who are interested in this type of stuff to do. You can get on Google, and if you go through the litany of different things in Google, there's Google patent search, so you can put in keywords. It'll pull up all the US patents that have those keywords, and you can search through. So I always think I have some brilliant idea, and then I search it, and I find that 15 other people have patented that idea 15 years ago, and it's a little disturbing and unfortunate, but then you kind of come back to the drawing board and go, okay, well, they've done that. How would I do this maybe differently to accomplish the goal? And then just understanding, what's the incidence of the disease, how many of the patients do you think could benefit from what you're doing? And those are important as you move forward, because to move these things along, there needs to be enough people to support investment dollars ultimately that would come in to develop it. So through neurosurgery, we've been very active in this space. We have actually quite a number of patents through the different faculties. Several of these ideas are mine, several are other faculty, but we've done a lot of different, very interesting things looking at sort of our workspace. And this ranges from the football helmet, which is sort of concussions, to a device to treat epilepsy. So Jeff Ogeman and Ray D'Ambrosio, who's one of our Ph.D. guys, have a really interesting cranial implant that cools the brain. And animal studies suggest that they can eliminate intractable epilepsy, multifocal drug-resistant epilepsy, just by cooling the brain. And so come up with a device that can passively cool the brain. So we're working on what's called an IDEs to do first-in-man study to validate the animal model. And I just got off the phone with Synthes, who's a huge company who's interested in talking to us. And if that works, you can see what the impact of that is. Unbelievable, right? You do basically an orthopedic procedure to do, basically a cranioplasty, and you could potentially reduce or eliminate the seizures if it works the way we hope it works. So just some neat stuff. So, how does this usually work? So we're really dumb as doctors about this stuff. We don't go to business school, and we don't know how the world works a lot of times. And, as I was training, you had an idea, usually you talk to the rep that came to your office, especially for us in like the surgical fields. The guys are always coming in trying to sell us something, and you'd say, well, why don't, I have this problem, why don't you guys do this? So you just kind of tell them your idea, and you hope that they do something, and usually they just nod nicely and go, that's brilliant, and then they walk out of your office and nothing ever happens. Or if it's a really good idea, they do something and you never get any of the credit or involvement. Some people are a little smarter. They go and interface with a company and they act as a consultant, and that's an okay way to do it. And I think that there's some clear disadvantages to doing that I've listed here. My thing that I've typically done now, and I like the model, is to bring these ideas forward when they're at a state of maturity where I think we can do something. We'll actually form a company outside the university and then license the technology out to that company. So I have ownership in the company. As it moves forward, I can continue to keep some control in terms of how the development process goes, and if something useful happens, then there's an upside in that way. The university is really great in terms of tech transfer. I've been very impressed with the office. They have about 50 people there. They will take ideas that you have, help you understand whether there's value to that, and then to help move that along. Again, I mentioned this outside company formation and the licensing. And I think that model for me has worked well because it's allowed me to accelerate the process of development. If you license, you're beholden to the company that takes it on to do something and whether they want you involved. I've liked the idea of actually bringing the technology outside where you can start to fundraise and build enough money and team around it to actually accelerate the development. And it's worked well over these different things I've done. So again, what's the process for this? You have an idea, you really need to validate whether it's decent or not. You need to understand the IP and whether it's a unique idea and whether you can own that idea. You need to understand whether there's a market for the idea that's out there. To be able to execute on it, I think this partnering thing is very important. Even if you're an engineer by background, you're a busy clinical person, and it's very hard to do all of this stuff. And I've learned a tremendous amount from the engineers. They're amazing. But what's interesting with the engineers is they're very linear, and I always have to kind of steer them back to midline in terms of what the clinical application is, because they kind of start to drift and they don't understand the practical use of many of these things. So it's been an interesting relationship in sort of what the role that I've played as development gets further along. I mentioned IP and market. Regulatory, I'll come to in a minute. Many people still think that, and I want to touch on this, that if you are inventing something and you're writing it down in a notebook and you're dating and signing it, that is an invention and you can tie back to that. It used to be the case until 2011 when they changed the patent laws. So the patent laws now are what's called first to file. So if you have an idea, so if two people in this audience have the same idea at the same time, the first one to get to the patent office and file it is the one who's going to own that idea. And it doesn't matter if 10 years ago you were writing in your notebook and signing your name and dating it and documenting what you're doing, that doesn't count anymore. So it's a really important point. And in academia, what's also important is public disclosure. So this is where a lot of people get tripped up. So you're doing your research, you want to tell the world about it, so you go to a national meeting and you go, I invented this thing, it's awesome, look at this thing. You've now publicly disclosed that idea and you cannot patent it. Same thing with publication. And so there's a strategy that I employ with this where you want to kind of run silent for a period of time, get your patents in order, then you publish on it so that it's protected. And the publication can actually act as an interesting strategy around intellectual property to sort of protect your idea as you talk about it. So it's an important piece of this that is often lost in academia because there's always this rush to publish, which is good, but it's bad for this.
Can I tarry there for just a moment?
Please.
I think in medicine, it would be fairly typical to discover that someone had published around this idea, had published bits of this idea. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, what's the standard to say, okay, I'm sorry, you disclosed the patentable notion?
So it's unique in obviously. So if you have an idea and somebody's talked about something that is obvious to an examiner and an IP examiner, then they may not give you the patent. And so it's a very, I've actually come to like intellectual property. It's like this chess match of figuring out where can you maneuver. There's always things that are around you. In everything I've done, there's always stuff that's around, but it's figuring out what the pathway is that's clear, that gets you to the point that you want to get to at the end of the day. So it's very common that there'll be publications or there may be other intellectual property that's surrounding the concept. But what you're looking for is something that's unique and it's not obvious that someone skilled in the art would come to that place. That's sort of what the examiner uses as their criteria to determine whether or not IP is going to be something that you can get around an idea. Is that helpful? Okay. So again, a little deeper dive. I mentioned the market. I think for neuro, there's oftentimes where there's a smaller subset of patients, and there can be viable pathways to develop those things, and it's sort of understanding what the number of patients are and how many are around the world that will allow you to figure out whether your idea is going to be able to move forward or not. I want to talk a bit about regulatory in a second, but the other thing is to mention prototyping. So I got a lot of criticism, I would say, early on for starting these companies early. And everybody's like, oh, you started way too early. And what they wanted to see was this fully baked idea, prototype that, is way down the road. And what I've come to realize is that many investors and people who want to move these things forward are insightful and they're forward thinking. And if you can develop a prototype that gets your point across and they believe in the team and the idea, they'll fund you. And then the development can happen, again, sort of outside or in conjunction with the university team. And so early prototyping can happen for relatively small dollars. And within the university, it's been pretty straightforward to find $50,000, $100,000 to prototype stuff and then move it forward. And there's various grants around that allow you to do that. So patents, I'm going to talk about this briefly for a second. So there's two types of patents. One is sort of the standard patent that you think about, but there's a patent process called a provisional patent. And the idea with a provisional is it's good for a year, and it gives you time to develop your idea and file a formal patent. It's relatively inexpensive to file a provisional patent, unlike a full patent. And the advantage of a provisional is it gives you what's called a priority date. So I mentioned before it's first to file. So on a provisional patent, if we filed one today, you would get today's date as the date you invented this thing. You have a whole year to kind of really flesh it out and develop it before you have to file your full patent, which is a much more expensive and arduous thing. The disadvantage of just filing a bunch of provisionals is if you don't act on it within a year, it gets published and it's public knowledge. So it's kind of a balancing act. So you need to know when is the appropriate time to take action to protect your idea. But I've used this a lot, where I know I'm going to work on this thing and get to the end point within a year. We file it, spend a few $100 to get that in, and then we own that idea. And then you can also start to academically produce on that idea. Okay, so just an important piece of this. I mentioned this non-obviousness earlier around patents. I've been beating this to death. I have a lot of colleagues, again, who think their idea is brilliant, but they don't understand sort of the patent piece and they don't understand the market piece. So again, I think that's a critical first step as you're thinking about this. And having some idea what you think would be the pathway, especially for devices through the FDA. Is this going to be something that requires clinical trials because it's so new and revolutionary? If so, you're talking $20 to $40 million to bring that to market, versus something that you can claim equivalency to something that's already on the market. And that pathway to develop something is usually around $5 to $10 million. So I'm going to talk about this a bit more. So 510K, so your strategy for IP and your strategy for the FDA are completely opposite. So for intellectual property, you're saying you're different than anything else that's there. For the FDA, you do the opposite. You say, I'm exactly the same as this guy who has this thing on a shelf. And you claim equivalency, essentially, to that device. So what we've tried to do is fall into this 510K pathway because it's cheaper, it's less hurdles. There are clinical trials, but they're often what we call post-market. So you develop the device, you start to use it, you gain information about the device that then goes back to the FDA. Sometimes they'll make you do some limited clinicals up front before they'll award the 510K, but they're smaller, they're limited, easier to achieve. A PMA is what you normally hear about, and that's the ones where you have to do these long clinical trials that are extraordinarily expensive. So it's important as you're thinking about these ideas to understand what pathway they might go down. Many people talk about going to Europe to test devices, and that used to be easier to go to Europe or to Asia. They've gotten much more sophisticated in this area, and the hurdles that you have to cross to be able to do this in Europe and other places around the world are basically becoming more equivalent to the U.S.
Sam?
Yes?
The one thing that I've learned in working with the FDA, I tried to bring a CSF infusion device over on an IDE for a clinical trial. And where we got hung up with the FDA was not so much on the use of the device on the patient. They were more interested in some of the manufacturing and sterility aspects. You know, how do you prove that this thing maintains sterility in a package for X amount of time, which for me came out of right field. I was not expecting that. So there's always a hang-up that you might not anticipate with the FDA. It's not just the device on the person.
Yeah, no, it's been an interesting learning process for me as well. So the first device that I mentioned, as we're starting to get out, you learn that the regulatory process is not, does this device work in the intended way? It's material properties and biocompatibility and trying to figure that out. And there's accelerated aging and all these different steps that have to happen. There's issues with the computer software that have to be well understood. Sterile packaging is a huge issue. How do you sterilize it? Even the shipping, they make you go through the process of taking the packages and dumping them over the side and seeing if the packages get lacerated. So they put you through a pretty arduous process to even be able to submit to the FDA. And so there are people who are specialists in this area. And so I've learned as we've gotten out that as a company grows in size and you start getting closer to the FDA, you're bringing in all these different people with this different expertise to be able to do the filing. So yeah, it's a really complicated process. I was going to mention again, sort of the path that I've done typically is to license it out. And what's interesting is the intellectual property at the university, if there's ever royalties that come in, they get split out. And so I've been making this argument to my chairman for a while that, like, say the football helmet does well, I could make as much for the department as 6 neurosurgeons in a year off of royalties. So Gatorade, like to UF, has brought in like a couple $2 billion, right? So if you have a really good idea, you don't necessarily need a home run, but if a department has a couple singles and a few doubles, that becomes pretty significant money that comes back to the department. And if it funded resident, travel and research and books and all that stuff, I would find that to be a huge win if that happened. So some of it comes to the university, some to the department, and then the inventors get a share of what royalties come back. But I've never found the royalty thing to be sort of, from a financial standpoint, huge, right? The people who do well are the ones who are in the company typically. Plus it's fun. Starting these companies has been unbelievable. I mean, if you like building teams and you like working with interesting people, there's a reason guys like Elon Musk and all these guys who've been successful, who I always thought would just sip a martini and you'd never hear from them again because they'd moved to their island that they bought. They come in and they do it over and over again. It's so addictive. It's so fun to see an idea. Like I got to tell you, like the other day, Monday, when I was watching all the football players wearing the helmet, it was a very surreal experience and very rewarding. I was very proud to see that. And, I knew we had a real thing when I was walking into the company that were right across from Gates Foundation in this big warehouse there. And I walked in and there were like 7 people I'd never met before, and it started out with just 3 of us. And it was kind of a fun sequential thing to watch happen to get to this point. And, I think it's one of these matters of like doing good, but also seeing an upside at the end of the day. And many people can benefit from this. Number one, our patients to the university. And they have this idea at Stanford, and they say it all over the world, that they're fine with faculty, coming on campus in their Ferrari, because that means that they've done something that's been beneficial to society, that they've made money, and they've done well in that process too. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There's many, many details here, and I'm running a little bit short on time. I have 10 minutes, but one of the things that's always a misconception for physicians in particular is that you have the idea, you bring it forward, you're going to own 100% of that idea and that company. And it's so far from the truth. And it's been an interesting lesson on how investment works, what happens to your ownership as a founder over time. And so this is just an example of a kind of fictitious cap table, but my model has always been to be very equitable. I always bring on a business leader who I call the adult leadership early on, because I acknowledge, even though now I probably could do this myself, no problem, but back in the day, I didn't know what I was doing from a business standpoint. So I brought in the business guy, acknowledged that he brings something critical, the engineer, and then myself, and we just split up the ownership of the company at the beginning. But as soon as you start to raise money, your percent ownership starts to dwindle. And it's much more typical, if you're actively involved, that at the end of the day, once you've raised a couple rounds of financing, that you're going to go from a significant ownership stake to about 5% or less. So it's an important thing, because most physicians have a total misconception about what they're going to own and where they're going to land at the end of the day. So if you have something that's valuable and useful, you can actually do really well. But I think this idea that everybody's going to be super wealthy from every idea that they have is a misconception. And I've had so many of my colleagues come up and not understand that concept. I'm going to kind of skip through this. So this is the second company I spun out. It's an ultrasound stylet to put ventriculostomies in accurately at the bedside. So we don't have anything to do this. We freehand place it. 60% of them are misplaced. They may function, but they're in the wrong location. We do it in the OR with with Stealth, which is a $300,000, $400,000 system, but it really is too big to move into the ICU or the ER setting. So we had an ultrasound guy in our department who's great. I said, let's get coffee. I'm like, can you put an ultrasound on the tip of this thing, this stylet? And he's like, yeah, I could probably do that. So we got 10 grand. He built a little thing and we put it on. It's A-mode ultrasound, right? So we're just looking at the waveform, but there's a clear differentiation between brain and CSF. So when you have this thing poking through the catheter tip, you can align it up and see the ventricle, and you can correct as you're going down. So Medtronic, Codman, a bunch of companies are really interested. We're doing first in man in Canada probably in the next 4 months. So, but this is a timeline, and we're a little bit pushed out from where we wanted to be, but you start to build out sort of how long does this take. And for many of these projects, you're looking at probably realistically about 5 years from inception to being in a patient. The Valley of Death is a concept that people hear, so you get early funding, but the middle ground funding is challenging, and many companies kind of fail at this point. And so these are bigger concepts, more complicated things, but important to understand as the whole process continues along. Are you going to quit your day job? Doubtful doing this stuff, but it's really fun, and it's been an interesting thing for me. And Pierre's the guy in my department who has had multiple spin-outs himself, and He told me this one day, and I do like this. I think number one, you want to do good, right? That's why we're here, to impact patients and improve their lives. You want to have fun, and this is super fun. Like, I love this. My wife hates it because I'm so addicted to doing this stuff. And if you make some money at the end of the day, everybody thinks that this is evil, right, in some way, but I don't. I don't think so at all. I think if you have a good idea and you've helped people, there's no reason that you shouldn't do well. And I think that there's sort of this change in philosophy that's happening at many universities, MIT, Stanford, where they encourage their faculty to even take time away, to let them leave for a year, start something up, and then they can come back to their job. And I think forward-thinking universities are starting to look at this as a way to develop faculty, develop their career, and incentivize them. And I think, we need to do more of this. So I'm going to switch gears real quick, just for fun, for the last minute or two, and I'm going to show you the football helmet. So one of the things that's really different about this than the other companies I show a deck, and it's a crappy deck like I just showed you, where I made it myself and stuff like this. We knew this was going to be a retail product, and the testing for this is a industry standard. It's not through the FDA, which is really interesting. And so we knew we were going to have to compete with the likes of Rydell and Schutt and, get the branding. And so we brought in a great brand guy. And so the slides are really flashy and fun. And it's been a very different experience sort of seeing that aspect of this company unfold. So the company's called Visus, means change in Latin, and we're trying to revolutionize the safety in sports. Okay, we're starting with football. So I'm going to give you the whole deck, okay, for the last 5 minutes, just for fun. So everybody loves football. Football's had a lot of challenges lately. It's well known in the news, all the concussion stuff that's been going on. And the game's threatened in a lot of ways. Year over year, there's been 10% decline year over year in Pop Warner football. So parents are starting to look at this going, I'm not going to put my kids in football. So it's a challenge, right? In football, if you look at the risk of concussion, is the one that stands out. Girls soccer is not far behind, but we always call out football. So when I started looking critically at this, you look at the evolution of football. So back in the early part of the century, football almost completely went away. There were a bunch of Ivy League football players who died from skull fractures and subdurals and epidurals. And even the president at the time got involved. They made some changes, started to introduce these leather helmets. A lot of those type of injuries went away, and the helmet eventually evolved to this polycarbonate shell. And since that time, really, there's been almost zero evolution in the technology. It's great for skull fractures, great for subdurals, epidurals, does zero basically for concussion. Concussion was never even an issue. I'm not that old, and I didn't even learn about concussion in my residency. Now we manage it. It's in our neurosurgery, Greenberg, and all this stuff. So it's really the last 5 or 10 years it's become upfront. So these are the guys I started with. So Dave's a very experienced guy. I'd worked in Medtronic. Everybody's a device type person at the inception of the company. Per's looking great here. He's the chair of mechanical engineering. So we tried to bring together medicine engineering and working with these different teams to evolve the helmet. This is the CAD design of the helmet. We worked with an industrial design firm in town to build it out. It was a really interesting thing because you learn that athletes care more about appearance and aesthetics than they do about safety. And if you're 18, you think you're invincible. And so they're starting to care more about it, but we knew the helmet needed to look like a helmet. And we learned a lot by talking to different people. This is the way the helmet works. So the idea that I had was, can you basically turn the helmet inside out? Is there a way to absorb some of that energy before it reaches the inner shell? And that was kind of the core concept. And so what we ultimately have come up with through several iterations is this column structure. And it has what's called nonlinear force deformation. And so what you want to do is you want to slow the impact and expand the time that it happens. And the analogy is just going back really to automobiles. And there's a cool video online for the company if you care to look at it. But basically what the columns allow is omnidirectional motion. So it's rarely linear impact that causes concussion. It's rotational forces. And none of the helmets address that well. This helmet, if you hit it with shear, it'll move in any direction and absorb that force. And so we're finding that the helmet performs dramatically better than anything on the market. This is the idea of the columns just kind of being able to move so they can get compressed, but they can also move in different dimensions. Kind of another look at that. But then you start to realize what's practical in the market, right? So one of the biggest challenges getting to Oregon was how they paint it. So this year, they wanted to use our helmet. They normally have 10 different outfits that they use. And they agreed to go to 2, which Nike wasn't happy about. But one of them looks like a disco ball this year. It's like a sparkly ski boat type of paint job. And so we had to figure out how to paint these things, label them. So all these different issues come up as the evolution of the product happens. You know, we've been making this analogy of, you know, how cars work now versus how they worked in the 70s, and I think it's a fair analogy. I don't have the video here, but basically you can see this is the best helmet that's on the market other than ours, called the Speed Flex. They put a little flexible panel in the front. I encourage you to go look online at this. It's on YouTube and other places. But when you see the helmet on the right hit, the head gets jarred. On the left, it softens the impact. The head just kind of dips in because the helmet deforms. So acceleration is the issue. There's some suggestion in our literature, and these are very early studies, and I don't want to, you know, tie everything to this, but there have been a few prospective studies that if you reduce the force by 5%, you can reduce the concussion risk by almost 50%. And we're seeing 20 to 50% improvement in the force reduction. These are just some examples of that. The blue line is us compared to other helmets on the market. So you can see a much lower G-force, and it's over a longer period of time. And then again, we're seeing these very significant peak G reductions, and severity index is the area under the curve in these different helmets. You know, again, demonstration, our stuff much lower, the black line compared to other helmets. These are rotational accelerations that we're seeing in our helmet versus competing helmets that are on the market. So the team now is about 50 people. There's 23 full-time engineers now, and we've had people, it's been fun, who were undergrads in ME. Instead of going to Boeing or someplace, they've come to work for us. So it's been really a fun thing to see that happen. We've gotten a lot of interest. Actually, Roger Starbuck's our biggest investor. For the old people in the room might know who he is. But there's a whole host of different people who've you know, come on board. Doug Baldwin, Sherman's involved with us now. A host of name brand guys are starting to sign up and want to use the helmet. We've really tried to take a medical approach. Dr. Ellenbogen and Dr. Herring have been very instrumental in helping provide some of their experience and understanding of the issue. And we've now reached out to many people around the country who are now coming onto the scientific advisory board to lend expertise, especially as we want to look forward and prospectively follow our players and understand what the concussion risks are. Seahawks have been great. This is us measuring Russell Wilson. The helmet's sort of custom fit, if you will, and provides some advantages from that standpoint too. We've gotten a lot of press, which has been an interesting thing for me. We launched in Bloomberg, and it's been everywhere around the world. It's been in London Daily Mail. It's been an interesting thing to kind of watch this evolve and sort of the hope that is actually brought with this product. It's a lot of pressure in some ways, but it's also extremely exciting to see. This is just a handful of teams who've signed up to use the helmet. And that's kind of it. So the reason I show this is I literally was at a pediatric neurosurgery meeting, and somebody at another institution was talking about some foam that they were working on, and I thought this is really just incremental. It's not going to change much. And I sketched it on a napkin, and I came back, and I never met Per, the chair of mechanical engineering. I just emailed him. I'm like, hey, is this something you might be interested in talking about? And he said, sure, come over. And fast forward to this point in time, we think we're going to do something that's actually really important. So I'll end there.
What about bike helmets?
Bike helmets. So yes, so we think the technology can be used in any helmeted sport. So we're starting to get interest, and we've already done some licensing deals with some very name brand companies who want to bring it into other categories. And we're likely to go into some other things such as hockey or lacrosse probably pretty quickly once we raise another round of financing.
Can I build an EEG into the helmet and then send that information wirelessly to a monitor someplace? And if if you sustain an impact that's in the realm of a concussive impact, it's likely to disturb that.
Yeah, so can you build in an EEG? Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's sort of the evolution of this is instrumentation of better safety devices. And so we've been in conversation with a whole host of people about not just accelerometers, but other devices similar to what you're talking about, where we could really understand more of this issue. We're very blind as clinicians toward concussion. It's a clinical diagnosis. The sideline thing is exceptionally imprecise. And so learning about what's happening on the field in a meaningful way is very valuable. And there's, big companies locally who are very interested in this problem, who want to partner with us for that very reason, to try and understand it and use big data and all these things that, catchphrases we like to use these days to understand the issue. Yes?
Thanks for your talk. Can you give us an idea about when you talk about fundraising, who sort of directs you in that, especially early on when you're unfamiliar?
So fundraising, how do you get money to do this? Yeah, okay. So I'll give you sort of a quickie answer to this. There's different phases to fundraising and different amounts of money you need. So early on, this is done with grants. So you can find internal grants within the university in places that are tangential to the university that you can get typically anywhere between 10 and 50 grand if they like your idea, okay? The thing I didn't mention are there are great NIH grants called SBIR and STTR grants that are partnership grants where some of the money stays in the university and some of it goes to the company, and you partner together. And those grants are actually much easier to get than RO1s. And they can be substantial amounts of money, anywhere from 150 all the way up to even a couple $1 million. And it's what we call non-dilutional. It means it doesn't go against your ownership stake. So when you go to an investor, they're going to take a piece of your company. If you go to NIH and you get a grant, it's free money, okay? So early on, those are some of the ways that I've financed these things, to the point where there's a prototype or some concept that I can then take out and go to an investor. So the next stage is to get money. And there's a couple ways you do it. So you either do a friends and family round where you kind of, everybody likes your idea and you got a rich grandma and she wants to give you some money, and you can do it that way. Or you can go to what are called angel investors. So these are high net worth individuals who typically invest anywhere between $25,000 and super angels or super rich people who will do $250,000, $500,000. They come in, they take some ownership stake, right, in the company. You give them stock for their investment. The next step is to do an actual qualified investing round, which is more of an institutional financing, which you're going to venture capitalists. They're usually wanting to invest big dollars. They don't like to invest $1 million. They want to invest 10 million, 50 million. But they also expect a 10x return on their investment. So usually you're doing that when you're farther down the road and you need big dollars to kind of get to the next step. So most of the stuff that I've done, honestly, has been with grant money and with angel investors. And we've gotten pretty far with that. Yes?
Great talk. Thanks for sharing that.
Thanks.
So as far as, I think my question points more at order of operations, right? So there's a couple of things happening in place. You're doing preliminary prototyping, you're forming a company, and you're doing research and development all simultaneously, right? And so then there's small grants that are maybe $10,000 to $50,000. It sounds like you're incorporating each of these companies to, as a corporation, to be able to allocate the stock. And so I guess my question would be, the corporation's only as good as the formation documents. How much of your investment do you put up front into a strong legal formation document?
Okay.
Versus, so, I mean, it's not like you're going to be repeating that process over and over. But
Yeah, so you asked a good question about legal counsel to form a company and do it
that's going to
properly.
drain your funds too.
Yeah, it is and it isn't. So in a town like Seattle, there's numerous large multinational law firms. And many of them will front the costs to you with the idea that once you have a capital event, you're going to bring some money and you'll pay them back. So I've been very lucky to work with several law firms in town. And this is very cookbook for them. This AR/VR company I just started up, they just spam me with the entire company formation documents. It's all 2 seconds for them to put it together. And it's all very standard type of language. It's a stack, an inch thick, but it's all pretty standard stuff. I think where a lot of physicians make the mistake is they go and they spend like, a ton of their own money to get something like this going, and they try and self-finance it. I don't think you need to do that if you do it intelligently. And many attorneys will want to take a little piece of the action because it costs them almost nothing to do this. And the filing to get the company formed is very simple. And so these are actually easy things to do where we as doctors think they're super complicated. And this is where, finding somebody who's done it before and can give you some advice is always something that I recommend. Because that part's super easy, actually, and you can potentially do it for $0 if you find somebody who believes in what you're doing. Yes?
Sam, let me ask you this, because there is this whole issue of conflict of interest and academic presentations, and it's not hard to go to a meeting and somebody say, oh, he's full of it because he owns the company or he has a conflict of interest. Tell us your perspective on that. You're right in the middle of it.
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely a balancing act, and I mean, I think sort of our history, as academic guys influences that. You think the guy who's working for the drug company is clearly in the pocket of the drug company, that somehow influences what they're doing. I think a lot of it is letting the science speak for itself, being very transparent, I think, is another important piece. So I mentioned kind of running under the radar. That's more just to give you time to protect your idea. But once you feel like you're protected, I think it's actually very beneficial to come out and start to publish and get your ideas out there in a meaningful way. And if you're someone who has a 20-year track record of research in a particular area and you have a great idea, I think most of our colleagues will acknowledge that, and it's all in how you handle yourself. It's just like anything else in life. But I think being very transparent in your disclosures, it has become a very time-consuming but important thing for me in terms of disclosures and how that happens at Children's and at the university and stuff like that, so that everything is well-known, documented, and you just stay ahead of that stuff. But it's an important question, and I think people will, in some ways, always have some question potentially, but I think, again, if you handle it properly, you can mitigate, I think, most of that stuff.
So, Sam, that was absolutely a terrific talk, and good for us to hear probably on a regular basis so that we don't lose sight of the fact that we are thinking and talking all the time. Good ideas come from that. So, 2 quick questions.
Yeah.
One of them I just have to ask, does your brain keep longer if you refrigerate?
It's a great question. So,
you don't have to answer that seriously. I didn't.
Yeah, well, it's funny, they found some interesting data with the animal stuff with epilepsy in terms of inflammatory processes by keeping the brain a little bit cool. So maybe yes.
So my real question about all of this, I do think that, just taking an average auditorium filled with reasonably smart people doing interesting things all day long and reading a lot, they all get ideas.
Yep.
They all get ideas, and probably a handful of people in this small group have actually gotten patents, at least provisional ones.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get into the soup of who has done this before. And you called it a game of chess match, trying to find out why your idea is unique. But for me, going into down that rabbit hole meant talking to a lot of people who assisted in that process and whose opinion I had to finally accept, and who generally were in a position to say, you know what, that's not as novel as we first thought. So talk to us about
Intellectual
this whole
property.
notion about
Yeah.
novelty, if there's anything more to say.
Yeah, so you asked a great question. So how do you determine novelty, and if you're going down the path and you, excuse me, you think you have something novel and people are starting to come in and starting to question it. So I'll give you a couple different perspectives. So one of the engineers I work with, he says something is always patentable. And one thing that we've learned is if we have something that's pretty narrow to start with, as you start to develop it, you start to develop additional IP that's unique on top of it. The other thing that's been interesting to see is that even if there's something that's close to you, oftentimes you can go and get that thing. It doesn't mean that because somebody has a patent that they're not willing to license it to you. And so there's the ability to weave through the minefields and get to the endpoint that you want to get to. I've never completely scuttled an idea because of lack of IP. It's made me think about the approach and figure out different ways to do it, or approach people who are in that space to see if they wanted to license it. Because it's a really hard thing to do. It's a lot easier to file IP than to do something that's actionable on the IP in terms of development. So there's a lot of stuff that's out there. And the other thing that's critical for people to realize is that after a patent expires, you can still build on that concept without infringing on them. So it's in the open space. And so a lot of the ideas, you'll look and you'll see a patent, but that patent may be done in a year. So you can actually start to develop around that idea without risk of infringement. So I've found patent attorneys, you know, the idea for docs talking to attorneys is never good because we're usually like in a deposition or something. But like these guys are amazing to me that they can take these complex topics that they don't really have a ton of background in and distill it down in a way that you can find publishable and patentable type things. And so anybody who's in that situation, I just encourage you to really look deep, and you can usually find a path to get to the point that you want to get to. So I think this idea of tons of roadblocks is some people worry about, but I haven't found it to be as big of an issue. I don't know if that answers your question well.
Yeah, it does. I think your answer is persist. You know, don't be scared off by the sense that maybe this isn't as unique as I thought.
No, absolutely not. And I mean, if you look sort of in the corporate world, like Apple and, you know, Intel, and these guys are always fighting each other because they have kind of overlapping technology. And ultimately what they do is they just license from one another so that they can pursue whatever path that they've gotten. Those guys will get some royalties. So we've done that in several of our companies. We knew there were people kind of tangentially working on similar things, and like their grant fell through, and I reached, like one guy in particular reached out to him and said, you know, this is really cool, you're a good guy, I've met you at the, you know, different trade shows, and I know you're not doing anything with that, can we work together? And the guy, for $0, but hopefully some royalty down the road, just assigned all the intellectual property to us, because he wanted to see his idea become real, but he had no path to get there. And most people out there, especially in the medical field, early on, they're in it because they're passionate about it and they want to do something, and they hate to see the IP just die. So oftentimes you can go to those folks and say, hey, you know, let's work together and make something real, and have been successful doing that.
Sam, that's great.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.